How's it going, lads? It's the Bald Boomer Biosparks. With Hardcore Classic WoW being released at some point this summer, those of you that are looking to embrace the challenge of travelling through Azeroth as a very mortal adventurer will have to consider which class to play. Today we will be covering the Rogue class and what it has at its disposal to survive in the hardcore game mode. Before we begin, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And without further ado, let's get stuck straight into it. The Rogue is quite beginner friendly, which has the primary focus of dealing damage and secondary focus on specific means of controlling engagements. Having the ability to use stealth is an asset to this class, as they can close the gap on their targets and pick and choose which engagements they want to take on. The vast majority of their damage comes from melee attacks and poisons, meaning that as long as the Rogue is in reach of their target, they are able to continually deal damage without too much worry about line of sight issues and positioning. Rogues essentially have an infinitely regenerating damage resource in the form of energy, which applies 20 energy every tick, letting players plan how they are going to use their next ability, and is by and large a very easy resource to handle. Not only this, but if your abilities miss, it's much more forgiving compared to the warriors, since you'll only lose a partial amount of energy instead. The concept of combo points is also easy to understand. You have combo point generators and finishing moves that spend your combo points for specific abilities, with the concept of the more you spend, the more effective the finishing move becomes. One thing players will notice early on is that if a rogue changes their target, they will lose all their stored combo points, so this is something that they definitely need to be aware of. Their secondary role comes in the form of control, and they have some very powerful abilities in this regard, such as blind, kidney shot, gouge, cheap shot, sap, kick, and distract. Being able to stun, incapacitate, blind, and silence enemies does bring a lot of value to the Rogue class, and they are abilities that players should be able to get the hang of quite quickly, and it allows the Rogue to tackle different kinds of situations with ease. Overall, I'd rate the Rogue a 4 out of 5 as a beginner-friendly class that can access the hardcore setting in Classic WoW without too much difficulty. Rogues specialise in mostly single-target damage. They have a mix of direct damage abilities as well as damage over time options through bleeds and poisons that can be used as the situation requires. As long as a rogue is within melee range, then they will be able to continually apply damage without much need to worry about positioning, other than ensuring they don't body pull other mobs in the nearby vicinity. Rogues are very good at what they do in terms of single target damage, and the fact that energy is continually regenerating in bursts allows them to consistently pump out damage, which in turn makes them a more forgivable melee class, and I'll give them a 5 out of 5 in this department. Rogues do have some capability for cleaving down enemies, but they are locked behind the combat tree and further limited by cooldowns, meaning the player will have to decide the best moment to maximise their potential. Blade Flurry is unlocked earliest at level 30 in the combat tree and is on a 2-minute cooldown, and when combined with Adrenaline Rush, which is on a 5-minute cooldown from level 40, the Rogue can give a very large burst of damage that is able to take down a few enemies in quick succession. For maximum damage output while cleaving, the Rogue will need to have Slice and Dice active alongside Blade Flurry, Adrenaline Rush, and a Thistle Tea, which at times can be enough damage to even solo the occasional elite quest mob. Unfortunately, due to the nature of these abilities being locked behind cooldowns, they don't offer the Rogue much in the way of consistent AoE damage, and should be keeping to their primary focus of single target DPS. So whilst the Rogue has access to some quite powerful cleave, due to the nature of their limitations, this brings the Rogue's AoE damage rating to a low 2 out of 5. Survivability is where Rogues shine compared to other melee classes, and actually becomes quite an asset in hardcore mode. Rogues have avoidance capabilities since they can both parry and have naturally high dodge chance. They even have talents to increase both of these by 5%, which gives you a further 10% avoidance if you choose to play with a more safe playstyle. Considering that Rogues have to be a melee and will be on the receiving end of many hits, all of this avoidance adds up into a lot of mitigated damage, which happens passively. Not to mention, a common talent taken during leveling, Riposte, disarms the target, which leads to even less damage taken. Rogues also have on-demand cooldowns such as Evasion, which increases their dodge chance even further, which comes in handy if you desperately need to reduce the amount of hits you take, or if you're going for a big Blade Flurry pull and you don't want to risk taking too much damage. Vanish is probably one of the most powerful escape tools in the game, as it enables you to drop combat completely and re-enter stealth. Just don't forget to keep a stack of vanishing powder with you. Blind can take a mob out of the game for 10 seconds, which buys you a large window to burst down another target, and ensure that you are able to escape a bad engagement. And Sprint, whilst very basic in function in that it increases your movement speed, it has many uses in that you can close down a target, or you can escape a bad situation. Also, if you talent into improved sprint, you can break free from any movement impairing effects as well. Distract also has its place, as you can split up mob patrols into more manageable sizes, as well as prevent a patrol from walking towards you for 10 seconds, which prevents another bad engagement. With all these passive and active abilities available to rogues, they come out having some of the best survivability amongst the melee classes. The only thing that draws them back is that all of these abilities are on significant cooldowns, which means rogues will need to use their judgment when to use their abilities at the right time. Overall, I'll give the rogue a 4 out of 5 for survivability. When it comes to leveling speed, rogues are pretty much middle of the pack. While being limited to single target damage the vast majority of the time, it limits how much experience a rogue can gain quickly. That being said, they are definitely not bad at clearing mobs, since they do have reliable damage output as long as their weapons are kept up to date. Only if the weapons are subpar for the content that they are clearing, that's when you'll notice kill speed starts to slow down and impact the overall leveling speed. In short, keep your weapons up to date as best as you can, and you can expect a steady leveling pace that you can be content with, which brings their score to an average 3 out of 5. When it comes to running dungeons or grouping with others, rogues are able to bring their control of combat situations to help with minimizing the dangers that the party will face. A common misconception that rogue players make is that their only role is damage. Now, while that is a large part of what they bring to the table, in leveling content and dungeons, the fact that elite mobs are susceptible to things such as stuns helps the group out in a large way. A clear example of this is using Kidney Shot instead of Eviscerate. A max level Kidney Shot can stun an enemy for 6 seconds. That's 6 seconds where that mob can't do any damage or cast any dangerous spells. I'm not saying that a Kidney Shot needs to be used every time, but if you feel that there are dangerous mobs in a certain pack that can cause problems for the party, then a rogue can easily take them out of the fight for periods of time to help them. Another is a smart use of poisons. For example, if there are many spellcasters in a dungeon, mind-numbing poison reduces their damage output massively and allows you more opportunity to interrupt their spells with kick. This is doubly important if certain mobs in dungeons are able to heal, as extended fights in dungeons while playing hardcore mode only increases the chances of someone being at risk of death. And of course, if you keep up to speed with your lockpicking skills, you can always open lock chests that are scattered around dungeons that would otherwise be inaccessible without a rogue present, unless someone has invested in engineering to blow the lock off the chest, but which in practice is quite rare. Hopefully you now understand that bringing a rogue that helps control fights in a dungeon is a much more valuable asset than just assuming all they bring to the table is damage, especially when everyone in your group only has one life. A well-timed stun or interrupt can be the difference between saving a life or mourning the death of a comrade. The only thing the rogue lacks is more consistent on-demand crowd control, which is why I rate their utility in groups as a 4 out of 5. As for race choices, since hardcore mode is very focused on PvE content, it narrows down the best choices. For Alliance, by far and away it's humans that are the best choice to choose from. Having access to sword and mace skill bonuses, which is what many rogues will be using while leveling, and even in the endgame content, it just becomes such an amazing passive ability to reliably hit your targets. When it comes down to it, being able to hit your targets reliably is so important as a rogue, since the faster your target dies, the less risk of death. Dwarves can remove bleeds and poisons with stone form, which is quite a specific use, and realistically, if you're dying to a bleed or poison, you've made other bigger mistakes that led to that situation in the first place. Gnomes have access to Escape Artist, but since all rogues can break movement impairing effects with Vanish, as well as those who choose Improved Sprint, for me, it doesn't really warrant a choice. Night Elves are at the bottom of the choices, since all they really have is some improved stealth and an extra bit of dodge chance, which isn't really too meaningful. For the Horde, it's mostly a coin toss between Orc or Undead. Orcs have a passive stun resist chance, which is a great survivability tool, as well as Blood Fury, which allows the rogue to pump out some more damage at the expense of reduced healing. Undead have more utility, with Will of the Forsaken being the obvious one, since some mobs can fear you and you definitely don't want to be feared into other mobs. Cannibalize is useful when grinding humanoids or undead mobs, and it can keep your downtime to a minimum. And Extended Water Breathing Time is useful for those times you'll be questing in aquatic zones and greatly reduce your risk of drowning by accident. Trolls have Berserking for increased attack speed, and while that's useful, it has a greater effect when activated at low health, and that is just something you shouldn't be risking in hardcore mode, and it makes the troll a hard choice to justify. When considering your profession choices, the obvious one for many will be Herbalism and Alchemy, since rogues benefit so much from the utility provided by potions and elixirs during the leveling process. Not to mention you can be very self-sufficient with obtaining Fade Leaf for your blinding powder, as well as Swift Thistle to make Thistle Tea. These two resources are amazing for rogues, and being self-sustainable to have an ample amount of these is a godsend when tackling difficult situations. Mining and engineering is also a valid option too, as access to grenades can boost AoE damage as well as crowd control options for the rogue. You are also able to make target dummies, but since rogues have access to Vanish, it doesn't really make it an essential choice. Cooking is important to level because rogues get good value from food buffs. Fishing can also be used to help level your cooking if you're low on meat, and cooking also allows you to cook your Thistle Tea. First aid is an essential profession for rogues, since rogues have no inherent healing abilities, and you can use bandages mid-combat for some health ticks once you have an enemy stunned. On a lesser note, the anti-venom sacks have their uses too. When considering talents, the most straightforward and consistent leveling spec is always going to be Deep Combat. It provides a range of damage increase, utility, and important stats such as your hit chance. It also has some wiggle room to play around with some talents that can suit your playstyle, such as increased dodge chance alongside your parry so you can maximize your avoidance. Not to mention, it will allow you to cleave down your enemies at later levels, which other specs cannot provide. There are some more niche specs, such as going for an ambush and backstab build for pure burst, but I would argue that has more value when leveling as a duo, and I will cover that in another video. There's usually a question about swords or daggers, since they can both be used to build around in a deep combat spec. Swords generally are easier to find, and you can get some very good ones from dungeon quests, and since you'll be facing your enemies from the front most of the time, it's just much more convenient to use a standard sword build spec. However, if you are dedicated to going down the dagger route, there are some decent daggers around in several dungeons and world drops that you can use if you want to build something that incorporates improved backstab. As for general tips for the rogue class, you'll find that non-spellcaster mobs have high health and armor values, and using bleeds and poisons can help you bypass this. Whereas spellcasters, basically anything with a mana bar is much easier to kill with direct physical damage. If given the choice between grinding spellcasters and non-spellcasters, always opt with grinding spellcasters, as you can interrupt their spells with kick, gouge and kidney shot to prevent them from dealing much damage to you, making your situation much safer as well as faster experience gain. Some useful add-ons for rogues to use include an energy ticker, so you can always keep track of your energy regeneration. Using an energy tick timer can basically refund 20 energy from any of your opening abilities. Simply use your ability just before your new energy ticks and you'll get a fresh boost of 20 energy at the start of your combat. A weapon swing timer is also very useful, especially if you're going for sword specialization. Always make sure you use your combo point generators like Sinister Strike at the start of your weapon swing rather than at the end, as you'll get more value from sword specialization procs rather than wasted swings. Make sure you create a mouse over macro for things like kick to interrupt a target that isn't your main target. Remember, if you swap targets in Classic, you will lose your combo points. This also goes for abilities like Blind as well. Another tip is making good use of Slice and Dice. Although it's easy to think that a lot of your damage comes from your hard-hitting abilities, the majority of your damage comes from your auto attacks, so make sure you weave it into your rotation where possible, or when you have spare combo points ready when you're about to kill a target. When you're dealing with mobs that run away in fear, consider using crippling poison so that they can't run off uncontrollably and leash more mobs onto you. Remember that you'll need your mount at level 40, so using Pickpocket on every humanoid you come across is definitely worth the effort. It's literally free money. If you have to use Vanish to escape and you're in a tough area, consider waiting a while for the cooldown to nearly be over. You really don't want to be in a position where you have to use Vanish and you don't have it ready, which in hardcore mode basically means the end of your character. And finally, is Rogue a good choice? Well, as usual, you are a DPS class, so you will have to do some searching if you're looking for dungeon groups, since healers and especially tanks are the classes that are in high demand to fill those roles, which can be a downside. However, there is always a benefit to bringing a rogue in group play, so you shouldn't be turned away from groups by and large. In solo play, the rogue is a very strong all-rounder and doesn't have too many glaring weaknesses, as long as their weapons are kept up to date with the level of content they are trying to complete. And if hardcore, high-risk endgame raiding is your thing, a raid can always slot in a few rogues, as they do bring very good and reliable DPS alongside the utility for interrupts and stuns where appropriate. Not to mention, a guild needs to bring rogues to Blackwing Lair to pass the suppression room. So if you're doing a solid job in getting your pre-raid best in slot, I can't see why finding a decent raiding guild should be a problem. Not to mention, if a raid does go badly, you have a better chance of surviving with things like Vanish and Sprint, and maybe being able to pull off a cheeky Hearthstone. Remember that rogues are behind in DPS compared to warriors, but guilds will still bring a few rogues and maybe use one for improved exposed armor. Overall, the rogue is a solid class to choose for hardcore classic WoW, and although it's not without its drawbacks, the rogue has many strengths going for them. And that concludes everything you should know what you're getting yourself into if you decide to play a rogue in hardcore classic WoW. Overall, the rogue is a very versatile class in the right hands, with many tools to overcome the challenges that Azeroth has in store for you. If you have any requests as to what class you'd like to see next, put them down in the comments below. This is the Bald Boomer Biosparks, signing out. Catch you lads next time.